Hello. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Maddie Sherbandi, and I am a summer program assistant here at the Fine Arts Work Center. And thank you. Most of you are here because you're participating in one of our amazing summer workshops. But for those of you who aren't, for 9 weeks every summer, the Work Center hosts week-long open enrollment visual arts and writing workshops. If anyone here is interested in learning more, you can ask me or any of the staff on hand after this event. If you're here longer than this week, you should really think about taking one of our workshops. I promise you would not regret it. One of our favorite parts of our summer programs is that every week our world-class faculty mesmerize our audiences with presentations and talks. Tonight we're going to hear from 3 faculty members. Writer Joan Wickersham and poet Rowan Ricardo Phillips will read from their work, and visual artist Liz Flood will make a presentation. These will then be followed by a Q&A with the audience. So before we begin, a bit of housekeeping and other items of interest. Books by Joan and Rowan will be on sale at the back of the room after the event, and Joan and Rowan will also be signing their books for you up here at the front of the room at that table. Other books from this year's faculty will also be for sale in our bookstore and at the back of the room, as well as some very pretty Falk merchandise, so be sure to check it out. The new Hudson D. Walker Gallery will be open after the event. Right now, we're showing an amazing exhibit called Density's Glitch, which features work by former Falk Fellows. The proceeds of all work sold will go to support Falk's programs, so be sure to check it out after the event. A reminder that restrooms are located down that hallway behind you. And another reminder to sign up for student reading night on Thursday if you are in a writing class and would like to share your work. And finally, please do us all a favor and turn your cell phones to silent. We'll begin with poet Rowan Ricardo Phillips, who is teaching a workshop this week called Feelings in Form and Poetry. Rowan is an award-winning poet and essayist. His writing appears in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, the Paris Review, and other national and international publications. He's been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Nicolás Guillén Outstanding Book Award, the Anisfield-Wolf Book Award, the PEN/ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing, the PEN/Joyce Osterweil Award for Poetry, a Whiting Award, and the GLCA New Writers Award. He's also been a finalist for the Griffin Poetry Prize, the National Book Award, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. PN Review described Phillips' poetry as, quote, eloquent and persuasive, and a reviewer of his book Heaven at 32 Poems called Phillips, quote, one of the best young poets I've read in years. Readers of his work are satisfied by the authority with which Phillips writes, as well as his dance in and out of the Western tradition as he explores the aching, seeking self. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Rowan Ricardo Phillips.
Thank you, Maddie. Hi, everyone. Call and response, I love it. I'd like to say bravo to the staff and the interns who are here. You do just such an amazing job. It's heartening, and we're all so grateful from the bottom of my heart. I would like to dedicate this reading to the poets in my workshop, who are also incredibly heartening and capable and warm, and they make me feel good about life and art. So, how does it go? Dante, in exile, once kind of trudged up to the stage and said to everybody, okay, I'm just going to read 3 poems. I'm going to read 4 poems. One poem from each of my current books of poems, and a poem from what's going to be the next book. So tomorrow is Wednesday, also known as Hump Day. So I told to my workshop, we're working on forms and feeling, right? I mean, how you can kind of write in forms but not be robotic or hegemonic about it, really kind of find your sense of feeling and soul. And so I told them to write a sestina for Wednesday. It's a kind of elaborated 39-line poem where they have to do certain repetitions and all of this. One of the wonderful things about workshops, of course, is that you've often done the stuff you've asked your charges to do. Not all the time, but most of the time. So I told them that I'd read a sestina for them. And here it is. This poem is called Bird of Fire. It has an epigraph from in the Italian, Il suo volo di fuoco mi cieco sull'altro. And its flight of fire blinded me to the other. Bird of fire. The blurred moon, blanched in the new evening sky, amazed me as a child. How could it live at the same time as the sun? Down star, I called it, captured by the melody that rang out from it, dusk bright, like a phoenix downed in civil twilight. The difference between the two, I thought, was difference itself. It made things real. But is the sky real? Aren't its blue moments like the phoenix just the mind's conjugations of to live, or the brain's long division of to die? Rouge le soir, bel espoir, sings the down star down night's starry throat. Already elsewhere, down star no more, no longer the sweet difference between real and dream I knew. I will die. I am not a dream. I am not quite real. I am a dream's firm ground. And I live because they are not what I am. Keep this thought for me, poetry, as the phoenix seduces dreadnoughts to drum the down star to sleep, and the skyline's lights begin to live like notes in air. And in that difference, that sleight of sun, may night remake the torqued sky and distill dream and real from live and die. A red cloud, speckled like an amorphous dye, ferries the internet's dead. Off to Phoenix, TGIF, double rainbow, nice sky tonight. Don't let this get you down, star. They speak, spammed or hacked, the indifference in that act excused in saying a guy's gotta live. I chased the verb with the bird that always lives, saddled on its nape as it dove down to die, its neck arched to the moon. Indifference spread through its ash blonde body, now phoenix no more, now part of the ground, now downed star. Its frame, first feathered by flames, flailed blue. Sky swallowed the phoenix, seized round the down star, sang sky down to the city, burned livid until it didn't, then praised the difference. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't get too kind now. I might read 5 poems. This is from heaven. This poem is called Kingdom Come. Kingdom come. Not knowing the difference between heaven and paradise, he called them both heaven. So when he shrugged at the thought of a God blanched in the lights of implausible heights, thumbing the armrests of a throne, that was heaven. And when he stared out at the sea, feeling familiar to himself at last, he called that heaven too. And nothing changed about either paradise or heaven for it. Paradise retained its earthen glamour. And heaven, because it can't stand for anything on its own, like the color of rice or a bomb, was happy to play along, was happy just to be happy for once, and not an excuse for mayhem. Okay. Don't do that. Don't do that. You all are too kind. I'll take you home with me. I'll show you all my first drafts. Okay. This poem is called Thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers. And so, what comes after heaven that's not heaven? Even Lucifer, having been hollowed out by lightning, cored by it, still called the sour, sulfide lakes and charred meadows that sprang up there, the dungscape, the sky tiled with its consulate of apostate dead, all this Lucifer still called heaven. And so, what comes after heaven, if not itself? The end, then, is always just the beginning of the end of that end. This is when we discover what evil really is. The end of endings. The death of change. That moment when you survey what has fallen into your range of sight and say, this is good enough. This will do. Okay, and then, oh, I love it. I love it. I love it. Too kind. So, this poem hasn't been published yet. It's going to appear soon. But, we're working on poems, right? And they look like this always before they look like whatever's in here, right? So here's this poem, and it's like this. It's a little long, but it's not that long. What did Paul Muldoon say? My least favorite 7 words are, I am going to read a sequence of poems. This is not a sequence of poems. It's just one poem. But I want to tell you what I did. So I took Wordsworth's poem, Tintern Abbey, right? Where Wordsworth kind of goes, man, as a kid, I used to go out into nature, and nature was really great, and that's where everything was awesome, right? That's where my self was. God is in nature, and that's where we're most ourselves. I wish I could do that all the time, right? That's Wordsworth in a nutshell. I just summed up all of Wordsworth for you. I took the last word of every line of that poem, and I used it as the last word of every line in this poem. Okay? You give yourself things to do. So this poem is called Child of Nature. It was up until recently called The Rabbit and the Bear, but then I changed that. It was called The Rabbit and the Bear because, you know that story about the bear and the rabbit shitting side by side in the woods? Well, they're shitting in the woods, and the bear turns to the rabbit and says, do you have a problem with shit sticking to your fur? And the rabbit says, no. So the bear picks up the rabbit and wipes its ass with it. But I figured that was a little too oblique. So I went with Child of Nature, which seems like a nice title for a poem, right? So this is called Child of Nature. I think the draft the editor has is still called The Rabbit and the Bear, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Thank you for your patience. Child of Nature. Maybe 7 years, or if not, some length of time like that has come and gone. I hear them in my head, in the clear mountain springs I left behind when I returned again to my hometown, New York. Its steel cliffs sag-glassed and sun-stunned in the weak impress of sunlight and solitude. Years connect and contract COVID. The winter-sharp sky and the cold comfort of a cloud and repose in it that once seen vanishes from view, as nature imagines the orchard tufts that cloud has passed over. The haloed fruits the sun and moon steal at dawn for themselves before the day starts, and the talking heads emerge from foxholes with their studied lines on the sanctity of God and Christ, farms, the investor, the glory of coal smoke, and the movement we need, swinging from trees. Having let be finale of seam, I spent a year and a half in the woods, culling from those cold mountaintops the next fire, feeling infinite and alone. What forms first, a thing or its form, the I or me, the maker or the thinker. A bird's eye view of life, what Arnold called the din of strife, a little like Floyd's Us and Them, soothe the doom of numb Zoom rooms. But what sweet prison's not still a prison? What kind heart isn't bathed in blood? What mind doesn't mind being the mind's second act? I was too abstract, perhaps, for the Berkshire snowfall, which day by day flared out like influence from a concrete dream about abstract life. The idea being that great nature acts on all living things in a way we trust, or must learn to trust, that it is a gift for the soul, for the lingering child mood in all of us, and makes all mystery answerable, all weight bearable weight, 40 tons of green size in a blue world that wait for an apt word in an apt mood. Blessed, blue-green, and serene, the mind put on a pedestal centered in a gold frame and hung on a sun-warmed wall. But my blood circuits the outlines of skylines asleep, unwept and unsung in that way. My soul has grown from an old tenement's power, my Old Testament a corner store's joy at being part of the life of things. This, as the kids say, facts, often not oft, kept me from turning soft, and all the shapes of nature turned in on themselves. No stir of air was there but for city world, where nature in seeing me cut its heart out while singing, "My country 'tis of thee," and vamped those vaulted buildings into woods, mountains, and streams. My country 'tis of thee. But now, when I think back to that lost thought, somehow found here in the sudden and faint power of poetry, perplexity sidles in with the setting sun again. I see the blue sky whiten, then brown, since John and Paul sharing a smoke and some blurred thoughts about diminished seventh chords or food in a small, smoke-soaked hotel room and hope one day to finally figure out, first and foremost, if this is nature. Row on mountains, whistling quail, the burned side of a flowering mountain ash, green screams like on the old maps of the world where man colored water olive or jade. No one would mistake any of these now or then for something unnatural. There were days when I was a child when I would walk by storefronts covered in graffiti, the paint still fresh from the can, the tart cataract of aerosols clouding the mind, a rock through the veined window, a pale mash of wood from a smashed guitar splintered like hay, me so horny oozing from some boombox love stowed away from sight, and a lucky charm left on the doorknob and of interest to no one but Tanya, who had walked past, stopped, turned back, took it, and said, "Got one more for my collection, yeah, boy." What was this, if not one of nature's many strange gifts? Or is nature only what you believe when you read? The hill and dale flex, we learned. The fern hill flex, we learned, alone and hour after hour, finding it oftentimes pure musical reflex, humanity responding in song to the strange power of an environment enhanced and felt, finally, instead of simply seen. Joy inching along the cracks of the sublime, like the music of a glass interfused with the life of all people, all stars, suns, and the sounds of it all, shattering air before the glass itself shatters. Oh man, I grew tired of whatever impels nature to always be elsewhere and thought, listen, yes, I have trees and rivers still. Yes, I have gardens and ponds. I have woods. I have a romantic park that was, behold, made where a village was raised from the world. I have had these things and what they half create, which is but half of what I recognize and welcome as nature in its own sense. For all park is policy, all venue nurse, every habitat a cradle for the soul, at least for the time being. Or perchance there are words like perchance that function more or less like what I meant to say, decay being part of the process, faint cloud banks frothing, then finished by the wind, part friend, part foe of what the mind sets out to catch whenever and wherever it can, read or listen to under sun or street lights. I too crave a bright ocean meadow while the sun braids the green with its warm gold. Once this felt the only way to be and make a natural world. But I can't betray where I'm from. I don't want that privilege. That doesn't mean neighborhoods bathed in lead are like bright emerald meadows that inform and reassure. Those marks left from the impress around our throats of old systems that feed on the disenfranchised, their eyes and tongues, their hearts and hands, the women, children, men, and everyone in between are both all there is and nothing at all, like life in the mazy motion of poems. Disturb what cannot be disturbed, and then behold as it awakens and sings to the moon in the late morning haze. This is the walk, the long walk from which I have emerged, free at last, after a journey of light years across a field of dead ideas matured to life for their own sake. Free in my mind, finally, to remember all the forms of my life enhanced by this dwelling place, its hard-edged abracadabra, heathen Sunday mornings, and phosphorescent grief. No one is ever alone with their thoughts. Alone on a cliff or here beside me, we are crowded by presence and perchance. We're listening to scream and screet. We hear the other, even as one of them gleams and the other one gleams. We can't forget one or the other. Ethereal scream and electric street, part of the same long link in the same long human chain. I came to this poem, the long one, with much to say. I took 3 big cuts at it with real zeal before, 3 moods of recall and forget. From ground, then heaven, then the weapon. Years passed. And now from my high window, the cliffs and canyons of York Avenue call me down to sing through fire for their sweet sake. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
That was some really gorgeous work. Thank you, Rowan. So next we're going to hear from writer Joan Wickersham, who is a beloved and longtime faculty member here at the Fine Arts Work Center. And this week she's teaching a course called Jumpstarts for Cold Mornings. Joan is the author of The Suicide Index, which is a National Book Award finalist, and The News from Spain. Her fiction, essays, and poetry have appeared in many publications, including the Best American Short Stories and the Best American Non-Required Reading. She writes a regular op-ed column for the Boston Globe. Wickersham has taught fiction and memoir at Harvard, Emerson, UMass Boston, and the Bennington Writing Seminars. Adjectives used to describe Wickersham's body of work include magical, extraordinary, triumphant, and gripping. And Solstice Literary Magazine noted that the Suicide Index holds promise that there are unique ways to tell complicated stories and do them the justice that they deserve. Readers of Wickersham's work appreciate its complex and spiraling nature while also raving about the passion and heart that's present in her riveting writing. Please give a warm Fine Arts Work Center welcome to Joan Wickersham.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm thrilled to be back here, especially moving to be back here this year, I think. And I also am very honored to be presenting tonight with Rowan and Liz, and just really happy to be in the company of all the people who are here this week. So I'm actually going to read passages from a recent piece of work. It's a long essay, a long memoir essay that chronicles a very complicated and difficult friendship that I had, which began in high school. It's kind of a literary friendship. The spark was that we both wanted to be writers. And so at 15, we were very excited by each other. And the essay is about 50 pages long, and it chronicles the I guess the story of that friendship and how it changed and disintegrated over the years. So I'm just going to read excerpts, and I've kind of squished some things together, and I'm going to do some skipping. So the essay itself is kind of a mixture of narrative and self-examination. So I think what I'm going to read to you tonight is mostly pieces from the narrative, but anyway, I'm really excerpting it. So the piece is called Mortal Enemy. One afternoon last week, I was sitting at my kitchen table doing an online search for Bobby Bocelli. What came up was an entry headed Robert A. Bocelli, 54, journalist, novelist, play, and screenwriter. It sounded like an obituary. My second feeling was shame and guilt about my first feeling, which had been a flash of relief, almost of hope. But wishing for something doesn't make it true. And anyway, I didn't really wish Bobby dead, did I? Bobby couldn't be dead. I read the beginning of the article on the Google preview screen. Quote, Bobby Bocelli had a way of making lurid headlines. There was the time he was arrested for beating his mother, end quote, and wondered what Bobby had done now. Then I clicked and read the whole piece. He had died. Bobby had died alone, the obituary said, in his house in Philadelphia, of what appeared to be natural causes. There were no survivors. I met Bobby in the 1970s when we were both students in high school. He was a couple of years younger, but I knew who he was. Everyone did. He was visible and audible. When he was in 9th grade, he organized a poetry reading of Rilke and Wallace Stevens. The next year, he directed a staged reading of The Wasteland. I remember that evening, and remember, too, that his mother, who was a judge in Philadelphia, came for the performance and filled the entire theater, the lobby and the auditorium itself, with the scent of her perfume. The third floor of her house was all Bobby's, a big bedroom and a bathroom. The first time I went there, I thought it was the most beautiful room I'd ever seen. A desk, a bed, and white walls lined with bookshelves deep enough to hold 2 layers of books. Behind every book was another book. Books I'd read, books I'd heard of, but many more that I hadn't. It was the sunlit kingdom of a precocious, precious only child, a pleasure palace in which all the pleasures had to do with reading and writing. Well, not all. Bobby sprawled on the bed or the floor and talked about sex, frankly and baroquely. He had not done it all, not yet, but he wanted to and intended to. And what about us, my boyfriend and me? What exactly were we up to these days? He quizzed my boyfriend and me slyly, relentlessly, and we ducked some of the questions and answered others. In fact, things were moving slowly between my boyfriend and me. I was cautious, he was patient. But under Bobby's interrogation, we felt ourselves to be audacious, happily dirty. We were titillated by being a titillating spectacle. If we felt like kissing each other in the middle of a discussion of Ford Maddox Ford in Bobby's room, we went ahead and did it, and Bobby sat there and watched. We were making a show of how free we were, how uninhibited, but in some way Bobby was directing the show. We were his puppets. It's strange now to look back on the extreme innocence of all this. We were just kissing in front of Bobby. and to remember how kinky and degrading and bold it felt, and how important. The day after my boyfriend and I finally slept together, after months of doing everything but, we went over to Bobby's house, and he instantly suggested a game of truth or dare. We agreed to play as if we didn't have a choice, and his first question to me was, "Have you fucked someone who was in this room in the last 24 hours?" So now I'm going to jump ahead quite a bit. I'm actually going to jump ahead 15 years or so, when the friendship had really fallen apart. More phone calls, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., several calls a night. My husband and I began taking the phone off the hook every night before we went to bed. Then, when things had been quiet for a while, we got out of the habit, but then the calls would start up again. "Stop calling," we said, maybe thinking that bluntness would work better than hinting, or maybe just too tired to be anything other than blunt. "Bobby, please stop calling." His fuck yous, which used to be cheerful, a chummy little punch to the upper arm from the joker on the next bar stool, had turned hard and violent. They left bruises. "Fuck you." A loud yet somehow contemplative statement, each word underlined, vibrating, considered and decided upon, as if the two words had never been combined before, as if the phrase were being newly minted just for me. "Fuck you," he said, and I hung up, and then the phone rang again. Sometimes the calls stopped. Sometimes when the phone rang in the middle of the night, we picked it up. What if someone in our family had had a heart attack? What if there'd been an accident? And sometimes we didn't. In the daytime, I had to answer. Clients often called me. This was before caller ID. Most of the time it wasn't Bobby, but then on some afternoon when my guard was down, I would pick up the phone and hear that unmistakable nasal drawl, "Joan, Bobby Bicelli." I was inconsistent. Sometimes I said it was not a good time. I was waiting for another call. Sometimes I stayed on but tried to sound cool, tried not to give him a toehold, tried to make myself into a surface so slick that he would just slide right off. Sometimes I tried frankness. "Bobby, please don't call me. We really don't have anything in common anymore." And sometimes I felt so guilty or sorry for him or nostalgic for the Bobby I had first known, that brilliant child, or reflexively falsely well-mannered or just plain rattled, that I would say, "Hi, Bobby, how are you?" and then either kick myself for having confused and encouraged him, or go on and have a pretty nice conversation and hang up thinking that maybe we could resume our friendship in some new and limited way, and then the vitriolic middle-of-the-night calls would start up again. Things progressed. You cunt. I don't know if what Bobby did qualified as stalking. I never thought he was my stalker, in the sense of believing that for him the universe was a black curtain with a single pinhole through which he always and only saw me. He had a list of people, names that dated like mine from high school and college, whom he badgered periodically. In the years just after college, there was a friend whom I would check in with when the phone calls started up again. "Has Bobby been calling you?" The answer was always yes. Later, as we got older and saw other sad things, we stopped comparing notes. I knew that if Bobby was calling me at 2 a.m, he was calling other people too. Maybe someone else told him I was expecting a baby, or maybe I told him myself in an uncharacteristically blabby moment. I do remember him congratulating me on the pregnancy, and me saying thank you with more warmth than I felt, not wanting to seem churlish and not wanting to provoke him. I thanked him and hung up and forgot about him. Then the baby was born, and my husband and I came home from the hospital. We were changing his diaper for the first time, terrified by his trembling red limbs and his cries and the black stump of umbilical cord, and the phone rang, and my husband went to answer it, and I heard him saying, "Thank you, I'll tell her." And then he came back, and I asked who had called. And when he said, "Bobby," I felt a sudden punch of terror and rage, and protectiveness toward our baby, something massive, disabling, and ferocious. I don't want to talk to him. I know I got rid of him, my husband said, but he's going to call again. I don't want to talk to him. We wrapped up the baby and I tried to feed him, and it hurt, and I couldn't tell if he was getting enough milk. And then he spat up and he was still crying, and the phone rang again, and I hoped it was my mother calling back. She had offered to come for a week to help, and we'd said, no, we just want to have a little alone time to get to know the baby. But that conversation had happened before the baby was born, and now we had called to say, please, please, come as soon as you can. And so my husband answered the phone, and it was Bobby again. And my husband got rid of Bobby again. And then Bobby called again and kept calling, telling my husband that he wanted to congratulate me. My husband got blunter and blunter. I've given her your message, Bobby. She can't come to the phone. Stop calling. Over the next few days, the phone rang and rang. We answered it or we didn't. Friends were calling, cousins, my mother-in-law, the pediatrician, and Bobby. I was tired and weepy and sore and shocked by the baby's simultaneous closeness and remoteness. He was literally on top of us. He was us. We were all he had. And yet he was himself, and as mysterious as a creature from another planet. You will know what his cries mean, the books uselessly said. And I felt as if Bobby was beating on the door. Stop calling, my husband kept saying. Then one afternoon, I was talking on the phone with a friend who had also recently had a baby, and the operator broke in. I have an emergency call. Will you take it? Yes, I said, startled, frightened. I never even knew an operator could do this. Had something happened to my mother, my father? Joan, Bobby Bocelli. That for me was when the switch flipped, when Bobby stopped being a troubling, troublesome former friend toward whom I still felt a guilty sense of obligation. I had, after all, encouraged him to call me a decade ago, and the excess and relentlessness since then was clearly part of his illness, and he became a menace. Whatever had been going on in Bobby's mind all those years, whether I had been a target of his hatred or rage or interest or simply of his memory, from this point on, I was afraid of him. More and more as the years went on, I screened calls, beginning with an answering machine and then voicemail and then caller ID. I heard his voice, but I never had to talk to him. I heard his voice and pressed erase or delete or 3 or whatever button or key cut off his recorded drawl in mid-sentence and dumped him into some auditory oubliette until the next time he called. But no, not an oubliette. I never quite forgot about him. It was like one of those games I'd always hated as a child, when you know to expect something sudden, someone jumping out from behind a screen, someone who was it grabbing you, the music stopping and you needing to fight for a chair, the wooden pieces shifting their precarious arrangement slowly under pressure, so that the removal of one more piece caused the spring to snap and the booby trap's wooden jaw to lurch. Months would go by, sometimes years, and then there'd be another string of calls. I'm coming to Cambridge next week, he would drawl into the answering machine, and I want to see you. We have a lot to talk about. Give my love to the Bambinos. I didn't think he would actually show up on my doorstep, but who knew? He had once. The line about the Bambinos, repeated in every message, scared me like nothing ever had. I imagined the doorbell ringing, my children playing on the living room floor, Bobby pushing past me to what? To hurt them because he was jealous of me for having children? To hurt them because it would have been the surest way of hurting me, which he might have wanted to do? Because I ducked his calls, because I was happy with my husband, because I was a writer and my work was getting published. The idea that there might be something there, something so provocative and maddening that he'd want to force his way in upon it and smash it, was improbable, I knew. But what about all those newspaper stories after something unthinkable has happened? He was such a quiet boy, and Bobby wasn't even a quiet boy. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. That was some amazing work you shared with us. So finally, we're going to hear from visual artist Liz Flood. Liz is teaching a workshop this week called Experiential Drawing in the Landscape. And although Liz is teaching here for the first time, she was a Falk Visual Arts Fellow last year and will be returning as a second-year fellow this October. Liz earned her MFA in painting from Boston University and her BA from the University of Virginia, and she attended the Mount Gretna School of Art. In 2019, she was a participant at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and was an artist in residence at the studios at Mass MoCA. She's received several grants and awards, including the Real Artways Award, the Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation Grant, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts Graduate Fellowship, and the John Walker Alumni Award at Boston University. Real Artways described her art as, quote, atmospheric and embodied, as well as depicting the chaos and emotional weight of our current national landscape. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Liz Flood.
Wow, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to the Work Center for having me back. It's really special to be here. And Joan and Rowan, damn. The hair is on my arms. I'm just like trying to get them to calm down a little bit, but really a privilege to speak with you guys tonight. So the plan here is I'm going to give a short talk, about 15 minutes, and I'm going to take some time to look at some work from recent years that have been real touchstones for me in my practice as a painter, as a drawer. And I'm going to speak about those through some kind of key concerns I have in my practice, and those are strata, communing, witnessing, and endurance. So without further ado, here we go. Nope. Yep. So through an ongoing practice of making work out in the landscape, outdoors, in the elements, my work surveys complex layers of extraction and expression and history, all within the American landscape. And I really started to think of this in terms of strata while I was in graduate school in Boston, and was making work at this site called the Quincy Quarries. And it's a fascinating place because, I'll return to this image in a moment. Maybe. Oops. There we go. Oh my God. So I was making work at this place which seemed to me to be such a direct, like a very literal stacking of history, of what's moved through the space, of how this land has been extracted, how people express themselves here. It used to be a granite quarry up through the 1950s. Then it was disused, filled up with water, of course, and was sort of a site of mischief, of, there's all these legends of the mafia, like hiding bodies in the water and stuff. And so this kind of site full of folklore. And then during the Big Dig in Boston in the early 2000s, this site was filled with dirt that was dug out to dig the tunnels for I-93. And now it is filled, and it's a public park, and the faces of the granite are all shrouded in graffiti, and it's constantly changing. All of these layers of expression. And I was fascinated, and still am, I visited recently, by how this place has gone through so many lives, and how it's now a kind of forum of public, but also very private expression, like these sort of anonymous processing of place, of emotion through the landscape. And I started to kind of stack multiple canvases into one image to make a painting that feels closer to what it's like to move through a place. I would bring out all my stuff. I was hiking up to the top of the granite crags, moving across and through, looking closely, looking far away, and wanted to make a painting that could somehow feel closer to this experience of moving and witnessing in a place, and also to the kind of history that it's witnessed. So here's a detail of that painting. See the dynamite tracks of the granite slabs, the trees surrounding the quarry, Boston skyline. And yeah, so that's sort of how I really was starting to think about strata. And I was a history major in college, so I'm always paying attention to what was here and what is here. And this place for me really kind of cracked that open. Here's kind of what my setup was looking like. I'd go out one canvas at a time, sometimes foolhardy in the elements. But I'm really interested in this idea of kind of setting up somewhere, being able to sort of see everything coming, anticipating things, and witnessing through painting. This is a painting I made at Skowhegan, and another multi-panel oil painting. And I think a lot about watchfulness and vigilance, and also communing when I'm painting. And I was on a nocturnal schedule during my time here, and I would paint all the way through the night and just look out over this lake, one panel at a time, and started to rely on senses, of course, my vision, but I was using stand oil and kind of dragging through the sticky paint in a way that felt closer to the sensation of your eyes adjusting in the dark, all the while kind of communing with artists who had been there before me, thinking about who has moved through this space, also communing with lost loved ones, all of this sort of embedded in the paint, embedded in the place for me. Here's a detail. It's kind of hard to see. You can see the sort of ridges of the sticky stand oil. Oop, there we go. This was another important painting for me. I made around the same time. During graduate school, I was making paintings of this tree in a park behind my studio in Boston, and I was sort of documenting this tree week after week, making all of these paintings, and a branch fell, the tree was dying, and sort of at the same time, my mother passed away unexpectedly after a long illness, and I somehow felt like painting in this place had sort of prepared me oddly for that sort of grief. And when I came back to Boston after her death, you can't even make this up, there was a bow from someone's wreath on their door for Valentine's Day or something that had blown to the base of this tree. It's weird. It's weird. So I staked down the bow and kept returning day after day after day in this sort of ritual, this kind of procession to place. And a year later, returned to the same site and made a center painting and put them all together, and was kind of thinking about the layers of grief and everything that's just kind of embedded in the land, I think, for everyone in their own way. Now, these are some installation views of a show that just went down at Real Artways in Hartford. And it's a body of work that began on the 4th of July in 2020 in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I was going there to do some research for my work and encountered swarms of armed alt-right militias there to protest a fake flag burning. And I was disturbed and angry by the, for lack of a better word, how fucked up it was just to see this sort of hate and violence happening at this same site that had already witnessed the same thing. And it just seemed so ridiculous. And I was like, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I'm going to keep making work here. And, summer 2020, not to take us back there, but such an awful time. COVID was raging. George Floyd had just died. The election was coming up, and just I felt somehow like these battlefields were a kind of, they had the answers of how to get through kind of America at its current, in such a bad way, by looking to a moment when it was kind of as bad. So these are some install shots there. In the fall leading up to the presidential election, I kept returning on the weekends when I was teaching in upstate New York. I'd drive down to Gettysburg and make drawings across the battlefields. And I really think of these works as communing with and bearing witness to the land, looking at past scars to grieve, and also to learn, and also to forecast future impact. That's something I've been thinking about a great deal. How being in one place for long enough, you start to sort of notice the patterns and sometimes anticipate what's coming next through the sort of lessons that the land has already witnessed. So after returning for months to make drawings and paintings in Gettysburg, I found myself in Washington in early January, sort of knowing something was coming, and made a group of drawings first few days of January, got out of there when it started to get weird, and now I have these drawings right before January 6th. So I think of my practice as one of keeping watch, as one of kind of anticipation and looking to of course, the embedded histories of violence, of trauma, and the sort of current realities within the land to learn and sort of where not to go. These led me to make, I was making oil paintings also at Gettysburg, looking directly to the color of the witness boulders around the battlefields that have been there, longer before humans ever touched the earth, and thinking about what those rocks have seen, and was looking then to the distant battlefields, but sourcing all the color from those rocks that were up close. And they started to feel like bronze reliefs or castings or memorials or scabs even. And so these are some of those. It's interesting seeing them so large up here. It's not easy work to be with, but I really think of it as ongoing. This painting, it's a little bit bigger than it's projected. It's about the size of this projector screen. I made last summer in Chancellorsville, Virginia, close to where I grew up, and at a battlefield there. And sort of moving off of these sort of monochromatic paintings with their slow reveal and their sort of etched surfaces, I started to look to the foliage around me, look to the plant life, look to the grasses, these sort of resilient forms that just keep growing and sort of taking over everything, and took out the color of the sky, took out the color of the atmosphere, and wanted this to be a painting that doesn't rest, that keeps cycling through, that is turbulent. And I started mixing grasses, I started mixing twigs, corn husks from these fields into the paint itself. And really thinking about what the land has witnessed, what it still remembers sort of in its tactility, and trying to learn from that and sort of build a kind of endurance and, empathy and care. And I just feel like the land has all of the answers on what not to do, and yeah, just constantly trying to learn. Now to wrap things up, I'm gonna show some more recent work that I made here in Provincetown. So I rolled right off of that big Chancellorsville painting into P-Town, and was really continuing on a lot of these same ideas of, I can't think of a landscape as quite as charged as the Atlantic Ocean, and feel like I've only just been scratching the surface. And there's just so much here. It's a vessel of war. It's a vessel of migration. It's a vessel of leisure, of joy, of grief, of slavery, of piracy. It's so much happens in this water and has happened, and the weather, it's violent, it's churning, it's at risk, it's just, there's so much there. So how do you even begin to wrap your head around it? I'm trying. But this is a painting I made at Race Point, which is where we went today, and made some drawings. And I would drive my car out about a mile on the beach. I had a permit through the seashore, National Seashore, and would drive down. I had a spot where there was a chasm in the dunes that I would pull my car up a little bit, and made a painting. It was sort of a panorama. I'll show some detail. That's kind of what it looks like when I'm out there working. So it was climbing up into the dunes, going down below the dunes, close to the water, looking north, looking south, and here's some details. I was looking at the remnants of some kind of Coast Guard watchtower, and I started to mix site material from these cinder blocks, from the sand on the beach, into the paint itself, and that sort of became its own mark and record of the place. another detail. And I'm constantly surprised and excited by the sort of chance of how things intersect, of how things move in this multi-panel way of working, and think it's starting to feel a lot closer to those initial impulses to want to feel like I'm moving through the place. And oddly, I think, like the green painting, it's turbulent, it's restless, it's so I think this is giving me a lot of ways forward for when I return here in the fall. And something I think about a great deal, as if it hasn't come through enough, is endurance. And my practice is a very physical one. I think a lot about, there are these, there's in Provincetown all through the winter when I was making this painting. Let's go back. There's really intense wind. I'm tying things down. The same wind that's hitting my body is hitting the beach, is forming the dunes, is making the waves, is hitting the painting, and we're all sort of in this dance together. And I want my work to be able to just hold on to that a bit. And there is this almost sense of kind of penance and I was raised Catholic, shocker, of like having to kind of earn it and be there in those elements to make the work. So last couple of things I'll show you I think of as drawings. And this is a drawing I made on a piece of found fiberglass, a piece of a sailboat. That's the sailboat. I pulled it up from the breakwater at the lowest of low tides at sunrise in November when I wouldn't get arrested, and brought it back to my studio and went out on the beach and made a drawing of the tides receding on this piece of boat. And it was interesting working with the marks that were already there, that were already embedded in the surface, the kind of chips and scrapes of this thing moving across the bottom of the ocean. And it was a very generative way of working to learn sort of through it the history of its surface. And it was sort of diving into the realm of the sculptural a bit. And here's another one I made right before a nor'easter we had in October. As it was starting to pick up, but not quite, I went up to Race Point and drew the storm as it was getting closer and closer on this piece of boat I found. And lastly, here's a couple of drawings I made at Race Point, which is where we all went out today. And drawing is such a major part of my practice. I like the urgency of it, the variety that ink, the sort of marks it can give me, and how without that kind of mediation of color, it's like a one-to-one relationship of change, of chance, of movement, and they start to feel really turbulent and hectic in a way that, well, the world is turbulent and hectic. And this is a drawing of a shipwreck that I don't think you can see it anymore at low tide, but it was visible at low tide at the end of Race Point last fall. And that's all I have. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was some really wonderful work you shared. So now we're going to bring Rowan and Joan and Liz back on stage for a Q&A with the audience. So if anybody has this, can you hear me okay here? If anyone has a question for our artists and writers, please feel free to raise your hand.
I have a question for Rowan. Thank you. I was interested to hear about this ESPN Pen Award, some poetry related to sports. Did I mishear that?
I wrote a book in 2019 called The Circuit, A Tennis Odyssey, and it was a narrative of the 2017 men's tennis tour, some of the women's tour as well, but that was the year when Roger Federer came back after a year off, and he and Rafa Nadal played that final of the Australian Open. which after a long time of not playing each other in finals. And that match actually took place on the same day as the Muslim ban as well. So that whole year basically started with the Trump administration. So there's this paradox of this seeming return to the glorious age of tennis at the same time that the global political situation, it's not a political book, it's just about tennis, but it is this question about how much does the world bleed into tennis, or how much is kind of tennis its own thing. So basically, the great thing about tennis is it's a sport unlike any other sport that starts January 1st, basically, and it goes into November. So it really is a sport that chronicles a year. And yeah, that book won that award.
I have a question for Liz. When you do your multi-panel paintings, when you start, do you have a sense of the composition and how they're going to come together, or are they done individually and then put together like a collage, or how do you approach that?
So when I'm making these multi-panel paintings, at least with the more recent ones I've been doing, usually I'll start by stretching a few canvases, and I'll have, for example, the Race Point painting, I started with just looking straight at the ocean. I didn't have an idea of what was coming next, and sort of allowed it to unfold one panel at a time. And then I move things around in my studio afterwards or as it's happening and sort of see where we're at. And one panel informs the next, informs the next, informs the next. And sometimes there are panels that don't make it into the painting, but it's not preordained. And I'm really excited about the sort of chance and the way things connect and the way things line up and how it starts to sort of create this like entirely new landscape out of that, out of those connections and the sort of disorientation that happens through that. So it's not pre-planned. But I do, one thing I will say is I build all of my surfaces very meticulously in the wood shop so that things fit together. So there is some planning involved. I'm like, all right, so if something starts with 3 panels, I may say, okay, there needs to be some kind of band that like cuts this thing up in the middle, and I'll go to the wood shop and cut something new and stretch the new canvases. So it is a very kind of generative process in that way.
Okay, so it's, in a way, it's sequential, somewhat sequential.
Somewhat, but they're not necessarily in order.
Right.
But yes, it is. It's, I guess, kind of time-based in a way.
Thank you.
This question is for you, Joan. I'm just wondering what Bobby's illness was.
I'm a little hesitant to, sorry, thank you. I'm a little hesitant to say, is this on? I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll just talk loud. I'm a little hesitant to say because I don't quite know what the diagnosis was. It was something that had episodes, thank you, of mania and depression, but I don't know whether it was bipolar. I don't know for sure what it was. But it was part of what I was wrestling with in the piece was that the illness made the friendship difficult, but it also was the way we both changed over time. It wasn't, I don't think the friendship broke up because he had this illness. I think it was, sort of the people that seem very glamorous to you when you're in high school don't seem glamorous to you all the way through your life, and things that are difficult in somebody's personality become more difficult to be friends with. But one of the things that I will say about this piece that was very interesting to me as I worked on it was it took me a really long time to write. It took me about 5 or 6 years to write this one essay. And over that time, I began it right when I heard of this guy's death. But over the time that it took me to write the essay, once he was no longer a threat to me anymore, and I realized all of the fears that I had about him were kind of nutty on my part. My feelings about him changed, and my feelings about the relationship changed. So it's kind of in that piece, I try to examine my own feelings changing in real time as I'm writing the piece. So it became a very delicate balance, that piece. And I also, the other thing I wanted to say about it, which is an interesting story for the writers in this room, a friend of mine who's an editor, I happened to mention that I'd written this piece, and he asked to see it, and he then critiqued it as a kind of not strong enough Me Too piece, and I was really annoyed because I felt like, hey, it's not about that. It's not about sexual harassment in any way. There was a sexualized component to this person and his way of talking to me, but it had nothing to do with harassment in that way. And then once I got over being annoyed at this friend who had said this, I realized this is a sign that the piece is not working yet. If he thinks it's a kind of not terribly clear Me Too piece, the answer isn't to make it into that. The answer is to make it clear that that's not what it is. And I think it's a piece about self-disappointment and also about my own ambition and my own ambivalence about my own ambition. So that kind of is where the piece went. I'm going to give you this non-working microphone so that you can non-work it.
I think you have another question.
I don't have a question. I only want to comment to Joan that is an incredibly, to me, fruitful territory to explore, is relationships and their change over time, and the ones that have dissolved and gone away. And I just sort of wanted to make that comment. That's a fantastic kind of territory to think about.
I have a question for Rowan. The Child of Nature poem that you're working on. I can't wait to see it when it comes out. And what am I doing wrong?
Joan's microphone, you should just turn it on. It's making a sound.
It's off.
Okay.
I don't think we even really need that. Sounds to me like your editor's fishing for something, like your editor wanted something.
Yeah.
You had nothing to.
Yes.
So what I'm wondering about that poem is, given its length and its intricacies and its weaving, and then also its subject matter, how much research, if any research, in terms of the urban nature view versus the wild country nature view, because that's kind of a topic that's in environmental studies programs these days. Is the city nature with a capital N or a small n? Do you do, or did you read those sorts of opposing views? Because nothing sounds academic, of course, in your poem, but it just brings up those questions of how you got so much material in such a lovely way of expressing it.
Well, it's been a somewhat constant theme in my work. In my first book, line in a poem that goes, nature is a lapse in city life. I mean, I'm somebody who was born and raised in New York and always thought of urban environments not as a lack of nature, but as its own type of nature. I mean, you know, I've gone through school and taught a bit, and I'm kind of familiar with those things, but the work for me really has been in thinking about it, kind of what is nature. If you're really passive to it, then the idea is that, for instance, this is nature, the work that you showed is nature, and other environments are not that. But they have to be natural to you, or if not, you're always living from a point of view where you are lacking something. So it's just always been also kind of a sociological idea in it is to not you have to love where you're from and treat it as a kind of natural environment and find in it all of the waterfalls and interesting spots and all of that. So it's really, if anything, more kind of work of translation and transposition. But there wasn't research that went into the poem aside from just, you know, reading a lot and thinking about it. It seems to make sense, you know. There's a poem by a Wordsworth colleague from Coleridge called Frost at Midnight, which I think about a lot because he talks to his son about how, you know, you will have all this growing up in the countryside, but I was reared in the great city, mid-cloistered inn, and saw nothing but the sky and air. And just always kind of thinking about positionalities when you write and how to find power and so you don't sound like everybody else. Thanks for the question.
So I have a question for Liz, which is that I was so struck by how your paintings and your drawings are embedded in history, and I was right from that very first image, having done some work involved with the Central Artery, to never have seen an artist who kind of layered the city that way. And so I was interested when you said you studied history as an undergraduate. Did you always know that art and history were going to try to come together, or has it been a process of bringing these two visions together?
It's been a process, and I think I really kind of cut my teeth painting in the landscape, and the more and more my practice evolved out in nature, out in the environment, really, built and natural environments. I was like, of course, I'm interested in what has happened here and what's transpired, and I studied history, and so all these things just kind of naturally started to come together for me in the language of how I talk about my work and how I kind of come to understand the places that I'm painting. Like I feel a lot of responsibility to sort of know my shit about where it is I'm working, and whether or not that's evident in the painting, that's okay, but I want to at least, I hope it kind of shows an awareness of those histories. So it's something that's really evolved over time for me, and what really kind of cracked it open was I applied for a Fulbright, which I did not get, but it's okay, it's okay, I know. And I was applying to go to southern Italy, where some of my ancestors are from, and encountered these paintings in Naples that were tomb paintings, and they were these frescoes that lined the walls of tombs, and there was some kind of topographic line, typically, sort of across the center of these frescoes, maybe showing the kind of terrain where the person buried below would have, the kind of terrain they would have moved across, and then some sort of quick calligraphic illustration above of how this person lived their life. And it just, something about that topographic line of like how much information that shared about the land, about the history of the land, and the sort of stacking of that, and how it relates to history. It just really kind of opened things up for me. And and the quarry itself is just a place, just seeing it all visually stacked right there, almost like Rome or something. And it really, just by being in these places and making work, I naturally started to find that language as I dug deeper and deeper into what these places mean. So, good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you think Boston has been particularly brutal in destroying neighborhoods? And then, I know that my mother grew up in the old West End, which is like gone. And I'm wondering what happened to that stuff, to the buildings, to the streets. I mean, did it end up in the Big Dig? Did it end up in the quarry? What is it, the dirt that's in the quarry?
The dirt, so I'm not as familiar with the neighborhoods you're talking about, but the dirt in the quarry